Do you have a printed copy with you? You must have a copy because it will be easy for you to take down the notes when I'm teaching you the poem. Okay, all right. So in the previous class, we were looking at the first two stanzas of the poem, not stanzas, the first two cantos of the poem. And we observed that in each canto, the poet is describing nature in its elements, right? And in the first canto, we saw that there is a description of the west wind as it is interacting with the element of earth. In the second canto, we see the description of the west wind as it is interacting with the element of air. Our third canto is about the element of water. Okay. Now, before I proceed to the third canto, I would like to ask you if you are clear about what we had been talking about in terms of the description, in terms of the ideas that we are seeing in the poem. Any part of the poem that you are not able to follow or understand, please let me know right now. Any particular line or any phrase or anything that we have seen in the first two cantos, if there is any part in the poem that you are not clear about, please let me know now before I proceed to the third canto. Any doubts or questions about any explanation, any part of the poem? Because this is a difficult poem comparatively. If we look at the other poems on in your syllabus, you will see that this poem is a little more difficult than the rest of the poems. Is my voice coming out clearly to you? Because there's a lot of noise from the fans. Maybe I'll turn off one of the fans. Just give me 2 seconds. And also let me know if you want me to explain anything that we have done from the first two cantos. Yeah, this is better now. Okay, no doubts, no confusion from the first two cantos. Okay, fine. Then let us move on to the third canto. As I told you, in the third canto, you will see that the poetic voice is talking about the interaction of the west wind with the element of water. So let us see, look at your texts, all of you. Have a look at your texts. Okay. And we see in the text it says, "Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams, beside a pumice isle in Bayes Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers so sweet, the sense faints picturing them. Thou, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods, which bear the sapless foliage of the ocean, know thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear and tremble and despoil themselves, O here." Now, the description that we get to see here of the ocean, the sea that is being mentioned here is the Mediterranean Sea. This is an actual sea, as you all know. If you try to locate it geographically, you will be able to locate it in somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea, is somewhere, in the southern part of Europe, as you all know, right, near Italy. So this description that Shelley is giving us is actually a description that he had witnessed on one of his boat trips. So as I told you that Shelley would often take boat trips to different parts of Italy because he was spending his summer there, and he had taken a boat trip from Naples, which is a place in Italy, and this place to the Bay of Bay. Now I'm going to show you some pictures of the description that he gives here, so that it will be clear to you what he is talking about. Let me first explain and then I'll show you the pictures. So around December 18th, he had taken this boat trip and he was so overwhelmed with the beauty of the place that he had seen that he had actually made a journal entry where he speaks about the experience of his journey, and he speaks about this particular bay. The Bay of Bay is actually a place in Italy. It is a bay, as you know. Now, a bay is like this enclave kind of a thing, which is not an ocean obviously, or a sea, but it is like this, this water body that you have. And this bay is actually very interesting because it had a submerged city under it. So when you take a boat trip on this bay, you will be able to see the old palaces and ruins of the old palaces there. That's the description that Shelley is providing here. So the ruined underwater villas and palaces and statues and sculptures that he could see from the surface of the water, which was crystal clear, was the description that we find in this particular canto. Okay, so just imagine this scene where you are sailing on a boat, and when you look down the water, you are seeing the vegetation of the sea. Obviously, you have the water body, you have the aquatic marine life, you have the vegetation, but along with that you also have these structures that once were there, but later on they were submerged by the rising water level. So there is this entire ancient ruined city that is there under this bay, which is made of stones. So it can be seen from the surface of the water. Whoever is floating on the water will be able to see it. So this submerged villas and submerged palaces would look like rocks that are standing under the transparent sea. So this is a very, very visually appealing description that Shelley is giving of this particular place. Okay. Now let us see what he is saying. He is saying, "Thou," this is again the west wind, "who didst waken from his summer dreams." There is a lot of personification that is going on here. The elements of nature are not just inanimate elements of nature. They're also like people, like persons. Okay. So thou is the west wind, who's like a person who's waking up from his summer dreams. So he's waking up something that was in the dream, in a state of dream. Okay. Now what is this thing that the west wind is waking up? The blue Mediterranean. Okay, and we are talking about a Mediterranean Sea before all the pollution and everything rendered it, completely grey. Right now, if you look at the Mediterranean Sea, you will not see the bluish thing so much. Okay, but we are talking about the time when the Mediterranean Sea was completely blue. So the west wind wakes the Mediterranean Sea from his summer dreams. Now, what is the image that we get here? How can we say that the sea is waking up? Or what can be referred to as the sea waking up? We can refer to a sea waking up when there is movement in the sea. Right, when there are ripples or waves. When you have a placid sea, when you have a calm sea, the sea seems to be sleeping. So this is the image that he is trying to create here, that when there is wind, and such a strong wind that is blowing, it is creating certain ocean currents that is making the sea wake up from its dream. So thou, the west wind, who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline stream. So the image here is of the Mediterranean Sea being lulled into sleep. So it's almost like a snake in hibernation. Just like a snake will coil together and go into hibernation without movement. Similarly, the sea had also gone into hibernation and it had coiled around without any movement. And he's saying that this putting into sleep had been done by the ocean currents during summer. Right? Now with the arrival of autumn, which is a season that follows immediately, the summer season, the sea is now in a state of tempest, in a state of movement. Because if you have seen storms on a sea surface, you will know how the sea seems to come alive. So this is the image that he is trying to build in the description, that there will be strong winds, tempestuous winds blowing, and the sea seems to have woken up from a long sleep, and there is movement on the water of the sea, there is turbulence on the water of the sea. Okay, and then in the second stanza he says, beside a pumice isle in Bayes Bay. So this is the description that he is giving of the Bayes Bay, and it is an island that is made up of pumice stone. Pumice stone is a stone that all of you are familiar with, right? It is a porous stone that you use to scrub your feet and your heels and so on. So, and a whole island made up of the pumice stone. So this is the description that is giving of the Bayes Bay. And saw in sleep old palaces and towers. So these are the submerged ruins that he is describing here under the water. Okay, quivering within the waves' intenser day. Now the waves are in action. The waves are in motion. The waves are getting intenser. So the impact can be felt on the ruins as well. Okay, because the ruins are under the water, so these waves are hitting below the water also, hitting these palaces and these ruins that are underwater. Okay, but these palaces are no longer habitable. These palaces are not, palaces that have remained in the shape of the how the humans had created. These are submerged palaces. When you think you have human or man-made things submerged in water, what happens there? You must have seen shrunken ships, or you must have seen other things that are man-made, of course, they're not part of nature. But what happens when they reach the bottom of the ocean? What happens? You will have vegetation growing there, moss growing there, the fishes will take over. Right. So that is the description that he's trying to invoke here. He says, look at the next stanza, all overgrown with azure moss. Now, azure is a sea green color. If you look at the ocean moss, it is not, dark green. It is like a greenish, bluish color, right? So you're saying that these things that were once man-made are now submerged in water, and now the moss, the azure moss has grown there with flowers. These are all the ocean vegetations. So sweet, and these flowers are so sweet, the sense faints picturing them, that for a poet to even recall the scene, the beauty of the scene is so overwhelming that he is fainting picturing them. The appeal, the beauty of the scene is so overwhelming for the poet that it is something that is so overwhelming to his senses that he's fainting picturing them. And then he says, thou, the west wind, for whose path the Atlantic's level powers cleave themselves into chasms. So after this beautiful description of the submerged city, ruined city, and the beautiful moss growing there, we are back into a description of the tumultuous power of the wind. So as I told you, an ocean storm looks, very, very scary because of the waves that it would create, of the ripples that it would create. And it is not only a ripples. When you look at, an ocean storm, you will see the waves seem to be parting waves. It's like, almost the waves will part and you will have a deep chasm or a deep gorge in water. So this is the description that he is giving us. That thou for whose path, it is as if the west wind is going on Atlantic. Right. So the west wind is going from the Atlantic Ocean, and as it is passing on the water is just parting. Just like it's a biblical illusion, as you can see, the parting of the waters by Moses' wand. Right. So here also, such is the power of the west wind. This is a reference to the power of the wind. This is a reference to the amazing royal, presence, regal presence of the wind. That when he is parting, just like how subjects would part on two sides when the king passes, or when a very, a powerful person passes, there will be way made, a way will be paved for the passing of the person. Similarly, the west wind is so grand, so powerful, so regal that when the wind is passing on the ocean is cleaving themselves into chasms. Chasms again means deep gorges. So just imagine a storm scene, a storm that is on the water, and the water seemed to be parting, giving way to the storm wind, which far below the sea blooms and the woozy woods which wet the sapless foliage of the ocean. So on the surface of the water, you have this extreme tumult, but then when you go deeper into the bottom of the ocean, of course, this tumult is not seen. See, the storm wind will not affect the deep sea. The deep sea remains constant, right? So the description that we get here is of the surface of the sea, but then as we go deeper, what we find? Sea blooms, again, aquatic life. Some of the flowers, the sea flowers are so beautiful. So he is describing them as sea blooms. Their blooms, their blossoms, but underwater. And woozy woods. This is also such a beautiful description. Look at how Shelley is using language. He's saying woozy woods. There are forests under the sea. But then these are forests that are not very clearly defined. If you look at forests on the land, you will see that each branch is shaped, each outline is clearly defined. You can distinguish one tree from another. But not so for underwater foliage, because underwater foliage is much more fluid, much more, you have these floating things. They are like, they're shapeless. Right. So they look like they're oozing out. So one foliage is oozing out into another one. Right. So he's saying oozing woods. which wear the sapless foliage of the ocean. Okay, so the foliage of the ocean is different from the foliage of the ground, of the soil, right? Because the foliage under the ocean is much more fluid, is much more shapeless, is much more, mixing into another one, right? And know thy voice. But then they also, though they are not directly affected by the influence of the wind, as the surface of the sea is affected, but still they know thy voice. You are so powerful, you are so tumultuous. You are the bringer of the storm. The association with that is always there in all the cantos. The association of this wind with the power to destroy, the power of a tumult, the power of a tempest. Okay, so they know thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear. This is again a beautiful description of an ocean or a sea under storm. When you look at a sea where you have an impending storm, what do you see? You will not see the sea as a blue sea anymore. It will reflect the storm clouds and it will appear to be grey in color. Right? Have you ever seen a storm on the sea? You will know what I'm talking about here. The whole sea seems to be turning into a grayish black color. Right. So that is the description that is given here. They are suddenly growing gray with fear. So that natural phenomenon is kind of, presented by Shelley as a symbolic, representation of something growing gray with fear, somebody losing color and tremble and despoil themselves. Oh, here. Despoil here means to steal, to pillage, to plunder, an image of chaos, an image of total destruction. Okay, so this entire canto talks about the influence of the wind or the effect of the wind on the element of water. Okay, so there are two contrasting images that we get to see here. On the one hand, we have the beauty of the ocean and the sea, and the underwater ruins, and an image of something that is lulled into sleep. Because when you're talking about underwater ruins, when you're talking about things lying dormant for ages together, you are invoking this idea of something that is in a state of slumber, something where no action is happening, something that is dormant, right? But on the other hand, there is also this contrasting idea of a tumultuous storm, of movement, of the sea parting its way because of the storm winds, and it is turning gray. It seems like it is turning gray because of fear, because of the impending storm that is being brought by the west wind. Okay, I'm going to show you an image of what I was talking about, the bay and the underwater, ruins. Yes, Tanuja, do you have a question?
Ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Speak, ask.
Ma'am, what is the association of the color gray with fear, ma'am?
The thing is, yeah, the color gray means that it is a lack of the rosy color. Okay, in the European context, pink or red is associated with the a height of health. So if you are healthy, you will have pink cheeks. But gray is a color that is associated with fear, with decay, with death, and so on. Okay, so not in the Indian context. Okay, a person looks like he has lost his color. He looks white or gray with fear when he is extremely scared. Okay, so but in this particular context, this is specifically related to how a sea looks like when there is a storm. So the stormy sea is associated with the idea of they trembling with fear. So the whole idea is that of the power of the wind. The wind is so powerful that all the elements of earth, whether it is earth or it is air or it is water, they are all shaking in fear of this powerful tempestuous wind. This is a wind that is powerful. This is a wind that is grand. Okay, and all these elements are shaking with fear, and you see the description of the leaves, you see the description of the clouds, and now you see the description of the water. Okay, but the scene that you have to imagine is that of a stormy sea. If you have ever seen a stormy sea, you will know what we are talking about here. The sea water is completely turned into either dark gray or blackish in color when the storm approaches. It's no longer the azure blue, right? Okay, Tanuja?
Yes.
Clear?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Any other questions before I show you the picture? Is it clear to all of you what we are talking about here? Okay, fine. Let me show you the picture. Okay. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, this is what we are talking about. See? The ancient sunken city of Baia, Italy. If you still go there, you will be able to see. So this was once a city which, because of the rising water levels, it was abandoned by the people, and the structures were all submerged. Okay, but then see, this is what Shelley is describing. The waters of the bay is so clear that if you go on a trip there, you will be able to see what is there underwater. Okay, and you can see that these are man-made structures, as you can see, but then there is moss growing on top of these structures. So this is the description that he is talking about here. They're overgrown with azure moss, right, and flowers. Okay, they are no longer looking like they're part of human creation. Rather, they are overgrown with azure moss and flowers. You can actually look at a documentary, or you can look at any travel video on Baia, the underwater city. It's quite a popular tourist destination in Italy. People go for deep sea diving, and they go and see. Okay, so you can just, yeah, this is the one. See, this is how it looks like. Okay. So this is visible. The ruins of the city will be visible. Okay, but then it is all covered by marine life and the moss and the aquatic plants. Okay, so buildings and palaces and villas will be there. See, sculptures are there. This is what Shelley is talking about. Okay, this is an ancient city. Okay. So this is base Bay. Okay, you can have a look at it later on also. But I hope now it is clear to you what he is talking about. Okay, and I hope that you have seen how a stormy sea looks like. If you haven't, I'll show you. See, this is how storm in a sea looks like. Okay, when the storm clouds approach, and if you have observed, storm approaching the sea, it will reflect the color of the sky, obviously, and the whole sea appears to be gray in color. Okay, now Shelley is imagining it as the sea paying some kind of a homage to the west wind because of the power of the west wind, the tumultuous, destructive power of the west wind, that the sea is kind of paying a homage to the west wind, and it is shaking with fear and making way for the grand royal sea, for the grand royal west wind to pass. Okay, so this is the image that we are seeing in this canto. Okay, clear to all of you? Let us go back to the fourth canto here. Okay, all right. Any questions? Is it clear to all of you? Okay. And then he says, if I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power and share the impulse of thy strength. Look at the number of times Shelley is referring to this idea of might, of power, of strength, because these are the qualities that he associates with the wind. Okay, so he says that, look at how he is summing up what he has done in the first three cantos in the fourth canto. So the first three cantos spoke about the wind and the leaves. So he's saying that if I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. So this is a reference back to the first canto where the dead leaves would run away, would flee from the west wind, and the west wind will lift them up like an enchanter, right? So he's saying that if I were one of those dead leaves, that will be borne by you, that you will bear. If I were a swift cloud, so as Canto 2 was about the west wind and the clouds, remember that they were scattered like shreds all over the sky. right? So he says that if I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power. So if, and the third canto was about the waves, the sea waves. So the poet is saying, if I were one of those waves who would be panting under your power. Panting means gasping, because with the storm, the sea seems to be the one who's powerless with the storm. Okay. So all the three cantos that he has referred to are again referred to in the first three lines of the first stanza. Okay. So he says, if I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, a wave to pant beneath thy power, and share the impulse of thy strength. So the poet feels the desire to feel associated with the wave and feel one with the wind, feel one with the wind, feel associated with the wind, and he wants to feel the impulse of his strength. Only less free than thou. And then immediately he's brought to the realization that obviously he is not similar to the wind, because he is less free than him. A wind is a free force, whereas the poet is not. O uncontrollable, if even I were as in my boyhood and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven. So, just like most of the romantic poets, the romanticizing of childhood, the idea that childhood is a time of carefree life, childhood is a time when people are free, childhood is a time when people are not overburdened with the responsibilities of the world and the cares of the world. So he says that he realizes that he is not as free as the wind. And immediately he says that if even I were is my boyhood, he recalls his boyhood days and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven, as then when to outstrip the sky speed. Sky speed, again, how do you understand the speed of the wind on the sky? By the swift movement of the clouds. So he says that if I were back to the days, the carefree days of my childhood, maybe I could have accompanied you for your wanderings over heaven, as then when to outstrip the sky speed scarce seemed a vision. And I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Okay, so he says that it would have been easier to associate with the wind and to feel part of the wind if he were a young boy. But now, as an adult, he is too, he's too enchained, he's too enslaved by the cares of the world. And he says that scarce seemed a vision. I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. Oh, lift me as a wave, a leaf, a cloud. Again, a reference to the first three cantos. And he is praying to the west wind, he is imploring the west wind to lift him, just like how the west wind lifts the wave, the leaf, the cloud. Similarly, the poet is also asking the west wind to lift him, because I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. So this is almost like, this is a very common trope that is used in romantic poetry. You will see it in Keats also. There are two common tropes that are used here. Number one is that a celebration of childhood and the idea that childhood is a state of absolute bliss and freedom and carefree life, whereas adulthood is something that is associated with growing up with evil, with responsibility, with complexities, and so on. So that is one idea that we get to see here, which is an idea that we get to see from Wordsworth and many other romantic poets. The other idea is something that we find mostly in Keats, the pains of life. Okay, human life and its pains. Okay, so that is what here Shelley is also talking about. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. Okay, so this life is painful, human life is painful, and the thorns of life often is compared to different things, but here he is comparing life to a thorny bed, and he's saying that I fall upon the thorns of life. Life is not easy, life is not a matter of a bed of roses. It is actually a bed of thorns. And he says, I fall upon the thorns of life and I bleed. And he is desiring that he becomes a part of the west wind, that he is able to live that carefree life that the west wind represents. Okay, so this is the association that we get to see here. And he says, a heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless and swift and proud. Okay, so the heavy weight of hours. Hours here do not only mean hours, but he's talking about the years. As you grow older, you are more and more shackled by the worldly cares and the worldly issues, right? As you are younger, you are carefree, you are happier, you are freer as a person. But then the heavy weight of hours, as if each hour is adding a weight on your shoulder and it is chaining you. Chained and bound one too like thee. Okay, so he is chained and he is made to bow down to the burdens of life. But then, on the other hand, the west wind is somebody who is tameless and swift and proud. Okay, so the contrast between the west wind and the poetic persona is very clearly brought out here. And in this canto, particularly, you can see the parallel with Keats' The Nightingale. In Keats' Nightingale, also Keats says the same things, right? That Keats says that the human life that he is leading is something that is painful, that is full of sorrow, that is full of misery, that is full of, that one feels claustrophobic about. And then the Nightingale song is something that is a symbol of freedom, as a symbol of, carefree life. But he is also aware that he cannot be one with the nightingale. So the same idea is repeated here as well. The idea that human life is entangled with all these, pains and all these, miseries and burdens, and one feels overwhelmed and overpowered by the burdens of life. Every hour here again refers to the hours that one adds when one is growing older. By hour, we do not only mean the hours of a day, but rather hours accumulating into days, days accumulating into years, months and years accumulating into decades and so on. As one is growing more and more older and older, one is getting more and more burdened by the cares of human life, the troubles and pains of human life. Okay, and therefore he is requesting, he's praying, not only requesting, he's imploring the west wind to make him a part of the west wind's journey. Okay, so he wishes that he were a wave, or he wishes that he were a cloud, or he wishes that he were a leaf, because these are the elements of nature who are carried by the west wind, who feel the west wind's impact on them, right? But then the poet says that he is a contrast to the west wind. So the west wind stands for freedom. He is the one who is in shackles. The west wind stands for, something that is light and airy and swift. On the other hand, when you talk about burden, the images or the associated ideas that come with the idea of burden is something that is sluggish, that is slow to move, that is hardly making any movement, right? So these are the ideas that are associated with the poet's life, whereas the west wind is tameless, he is swift, and he is proud. Okay, clear this fourth canto? And then we move on to the fifth canto, which is a continuation of the idea of the fourth canto, where he says the same thing about, how he wishes to be a part of the west wind. And he says, make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone. Sweet though in sadness, be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth, and by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Okay, beautifully written lines. Let us see what is happening here. So in the fourth canto, the poet is acutely aware of the difference between the human poet, and the west wind, and he wishes that he were part of the elemental aspects of nature who would be in association with the wind. In the fifth canto, he's talking about making the wind his, his messenger, his carrier. And he says that you make me your lyre. Lyre is a musical instrument. So it's a musical instrument that is played by, again, blowing the air. So it is something that a wind is associated with. And similarly, he is seeing, the image that he is invoking here is of a forest. So when a wind blows through the forest, it creates a strange sound, it creates a strange music, okay, as if the forest is acting as a musical instrument for the wind. So the poet is also saying that make me thy lyre even as the forest is. So just like the forest is a musical instrument for you, when you blow through the trees of the forest, you will see a strange music emanating from there. Similarly, the poet also asks the wind to be his lyre, okay? And what if my leaves are falling like its own? So the poet is comparing himself to the forest. So just like the autumnal forest, here we have to understand that the forest that we are talking about here is not the lush green, deciduous forest, but rather we are talking about an autumnal forest where when the wind blows, the rest of the leaves will also shake and fall down, creating a weird, swooshing music through the woods. Okay, so this is the image that we are getting here. So he is also saying that my leaves are also falling like its own. The poet is also going through a phase of decay. The poet is also going through a phase of degeneration. He is also shedding leaves. He is almost like he has approached the end of his life cycle as well. Okay, so what if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmony. So, this music that is created by the blowing of the wind through the forest, and that two forests that are in ruins, only the dead branches would be there in an autumnal forest. That is a harmony that is beautiful, but at the same time, it is a harmony that is tumultuous. It carries the music of tumult, it carries the music of destruction. Right? So he says that the tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Okay, so this is a combination of death and life. This is a combination of sweetness and sadness. Okay, so this is a music that is appealing, a music that is soul touching, but at the same time, this is not a happy music. This is not a lively music. This is not the music of jubilation and celebration. This is a music which marks the end, right? It is almost like a dirge that we are talking about here. So sweet though in sadness. Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit. Here the poet is saying that, okay, fine, I am shackled, I am burdened, I am bowed down by the cares of life, but you are the free spirited one. So you be my spirit, you be my messenger. See how there is an inversion here. In the first part of the fifth canto, him is asking the west wind to be the wind, and he will be the musical instrument. And in the middle of the canto here, he is turning the whole thing around and he is saying that you be my messenger. Okay, so he's imploring the west wind to be his messenger, to be his spirit. Be thou spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me impetuous one. Impetuous means, again, something that is violent, something that is forceful, something that is impulsive. So, since the poet is not able to transcend his burden, he's asking the wind to act as his emissary, act as his messenger. Okay, be thou me impetuous one. And what is the wind supposed to do as his messenger, as his emissary? He says, drive my death thoughts over the universe. So, just like the year is coming to an end and autumn marks the end of the seasonal cycle, and when autumn comes, winter is the next season that is there. So, there will be a period of death, there will be a period of decay, but at the same time, the end of the season also marks the beginning of the year. So this is what the image that he is trying to pull it up here. He says, drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. So along with death, there is also a juxtaposition of the idea of birth. Unless death is there, you cannot have a new birth. When you come at the end of the year, you always look forward to the new year, isn't it? So when you come to the end of the year, you are not talking about an end, you are also talking about a new beginning. So that is what he is also talking about here. He's saying that the old thoughts, just like the old leaves, will have to go only so that we make place for a new beginning. Okay, so drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. Every end will mark a new beginning. Every end of a cycle will mark a new birth. Okay, so the end of the cycle, the end of autumn, will also quicken, hasten the beginning of the new cycle. And by incantation of this verse, this is where the idea of the romantic poet comes in. The romantic poet believes that he is a prophet. He has special duty and special responsibility towards mankind to teach mankind, to give the message to the mankind that people who are incapable of a poetic imagination should be able to see the world through the poet's eyes. Okay, so that is why he's saying that. And by the incantation of this verse, this poem itself, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth ashes and sparks. Again, the image of something dying but not completely dead. So when you think of the fireplace, hearth is the fireplace, it has almost died out, right? It is almost at the end of a fireplace that has the firewoods that has burned for a long time, and it has reached the end of its burning, but still there will be ashes and sparks. Okay, so he is saying that by the incantation of the verse, scatter my words among mankind. Try to understand the sentence construction here. Okay. And by the incantation of the verse, scatter, and then you have the comma here. So leave that part. Just try to make sense of the sentence. Scatter my words among mankind. And what is the comparison of these words? The comparison of these words are from the unextinguished hearth. The hearth is burning. Though it is coming to the end of the cycle, but still the earth has a lot of power to start a new spark. Okay, so when you have a burning fireplace, if you fan that burning fireplace, there will be ashes, of course, because the fireplace has burned. But at the same time, there will also be sparks. And what will a spark do? It can start a new fire. So the idea is that Shelley is saying, the poet is saying, that even though the poet is old, there has been burdens of years on him, and he is bowed down and he is burdened, still his words can mark a new beginning. And it is the west wind who should act as the messenger of the poet and carry his words to the rest of the world, because the poet is not able to do so. But the west wind, because he is free, because he has access to every element of nature, therefore the west wind should act as his emissary, as his messenger, and carry the words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth. He's comparing earth or humanity as things that are unawakened. They're still in slumber. They're still in sleep. Okay. This again, this is a reference to an idea of a revolution. A revolution comes when there is some injustice happening, and people wake up to take action. Okay, so he says that his ideas or his words will be revolutionary, and the revolution has to be started through a spark, through the poem. And he says that, be through my lips to unawakened earth a trumpet of a prophecy. Okay, so be my messenger, give this message to the rest of the world. Let it be a wake up call to the rest of the world. Okay, and what is the message that he wants to give? This whole canto is talking about giving a message, but the message comes at the very last line of the canto, and he says, "O wind," this is the message that he wants to give to humanity. "O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind?" So this is the message that he wants to give to the rest of the people, that do not be sad, do not be depressed, do not lose hope, because if you are going through the darkest hour of your times, if you're going through the darkest hour in terms of your political troubles, in terms of your economic troubles, in terms of your social troubles, or any dark hour of a nation, this is not permanent, because if winter comes, can spring be far behind. Okay, so this is all about the poem and how he is giving, how he's seeing nature. As I told you, I mean, nature here is not only nature and its natural elements, but rather it is a symbolic element that we get to see in nature. This is nature where we get to see nature serving some symbolic meaning here. Okay, and this is the meaning that we get to see where the west wind stands for the new beginning. The west wind stands for the revolution that will change the injustices that are happening right now. Okay, I have to give you, a background to the poem in the next class. I'm going to, when I discuss this, I'm going to give you a historical background to the poem also, which will make it clear what kind of dark hour was he talking about. Shelley had written this poem as a response to certain political atrocities that were happening in England. Okay, and he thought that, or he projected it as the darkest hour for the democracy. Okay, so he says that, human rights were curbed, people were tortured, people's protests were, kind of throttled. The government was acting very, very, irresponsible and tyrannical. In a situation like this, people are supposed to lose hope. They might seem that this is the darkest hour for the nation. But then the message that he wants the West Wind to carry is that if winter is here, can spring be far behind. So even in, the utmost darkest hour of life, one has to think of this inspiration that if the darkest hour is here, there'll always be a new beginning because it is never permanent. Okay, a cycle ends and a cycle begins. Something ends, something dies, so that something new can come up. Okay, so even in the most despondent of the hours, there would be a message that the poet wants to give to people. And he wants the West Wind to carry this message as a clarion call, a wake up call for the people. Because, I mean, in any regime that is tyrannical, in any regime that kind of, curbs the powers or the, rights of the people, you will see that. For a long time it will carry on. We had seen it in the Holocaust. We'll see it in, when racism was on and so on. Any regime that is, unjust to a group of people, it will carry on for some time. And there will be, people will reach that ultimate point of pain, of torture, of, suffering. And eventually there will be a wake-up call. And eventually there will be a revolution that will change things. Okay, so this is exactly what he's talking about here as well. That yes, it is winter, it is the darkest hour. England is going through a very bad, time. But at the same time, we have to remember that if winter is here, can spring be far behind? Okay, all right. We will discuss the other aspects of the poem in the next class. Today, I've just explained the poem in whole. Any questions or comments? Anything that you would like to add to the discussion? Please do so.